Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful, creepy human being you, and welcome to today's true crime episode. I'm so happy that you are here. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the murder of 42-year-old Kimberly Cates and the attempted murder of her daughter, 11-year-old Jaimie. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. Now, before we get into the details of today's case, I first need to say a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, and that is Aura. Now, I want to start this off with a question for you, okay? And the question for you is this. Have you ever Googled your name or the name of somebody you loved and been surprised to see how much of yours or their personal and private information was available on one of those public listing sites? Because when I tell you, it is far more common than you may realize for your private information to get out into the internet. And that's because there are these things out there called data brokers, and they take your information and they sell it to people that you really don't want to have it, like spammers and robocallers. Okay, they can even find out where you live, where you lay your head at night. I am not down with that sickness. I value my privacy and I value your privacy, and that's why I want to introduce you to Aura. Now, I have a question for you. Another question. I'm full of questions. Did you know that data brokers are legally required to remove your information if you ask them to? That sounds great, except they make it super difficult for you to figure out which data brokers even have your information, and that's one of the ways in which Aura comes in. They identify which of the data brokers have your information, and they submit the opt-out requests on your behalf. They do the work so that you do not have to. Now, when I first signed up for Aura, of course, the thing I was most interested in was how many of these data brokers really could have my information. So I went to the data broker opt-out section, and it turned out like 30. And Aura had already submitted the opt-out request on my behalf. Thank you, Aura. They also check to see if your information has been leaked on the dark web, and if you know, you know. No one wants their information leaked on the dark web, and they check to see if the passwords you use for things like, your banking are secure. Speaking of things you don't want out on the internet, right? Your money, that's very important. And those are just a couple of examples of ways that Aura helps keep you and yours safe from online threats that you just simply cannot see. Through just the Aura app, which is super easy to set up, you can get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. And you get it all at one place. There's no need for several different apps, and you get it all at one affordable price. Now, it sounds like a great deal to me, but listen, I'm not your mom and I can't tell you what to do. But what I can tell you is that I'm not going to leave myself and my family vulnerable to breaches and brokers. And if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/Bratterstein to get 2 weeks free through my link. And if you are wondering, that is enough time for them to see if your personal data has been exposed. So if all of that sounds as good to you as it does to me, make sure to click the link in my description box. It's aura.com/Bratterstein, and it lets them know I'm the one that sent you. And get a 14-day free trial to see if your personal and private information has been leaked online. And if it has, let Aura help you put a stop to it today. Now, I just want to say a big thank you to Aura for partnering with me on today's video. It's partners like Aura that make it possible for me to put out videos as consistently as I do. And a big thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock, don't ever change. Now, with all that said, let's go ahead and get into this video. This video is on a case out of Mont Vernon, which is in New Hampshire. And there are a lot of cases that I have covered that one could consider nightmare-inducing. But this particular case, this is probably one of the most terrifying things I've ever heard of, one of the most terrifying cases that I've ever read. And by read, I mean read about. The murder of Kimberly Cates was a thrill killing, okay? And it attracted national attention due to, one, the brutal nature of the murder, because it was insanity. Also, the fact that Kimberly's home was picked at random, the lack of remorse from her murderers, and also the ages of her murderers. So with that, today I'm going to tell you the entire story. I read all the things that you do not have to. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer the question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it kicking around in your brain as we go through the details of this case. But of course, I want you to answer once you have something to go on. But the question of the day is this. Do you think any of the individuals who are responsible for Kimberly's murder and Jaimie's attempted murder should ever be given the opportunity for parole? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through the details of this case. And with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murder of 42-year-old Kimberly Cates and the attempted murder of her 11-year-old daughter, Jaimie. Now, I want to start this case summary, this case discussion, rather, because it's not a summary, because of how, well, it could be argued it's a summary, because though it is an hour, everything is very complex and there's always more to be told. But I want to start this off with a quote for you. And this is a quote from a man named Mr. Michael Washburn, who wrote an article about this case closer to the time that it took place, okay? And I found it to be a great resource when researching this case. And he said of the murders committed in this case, quote, "They did it for kicks. They did it for thrills. They killed because there were people that could be killed." So as I said in the beginning, our story today is going to take place in a place. It's going to take place in a place called Mont Vernon, and this was in New Hampshire. This was a small and quiet community of about 2,000 people that was, quote, nestled in the south central part of the state. It was a safe place with hardly any crime. You really only heard about bad things happening in like larger towns and larger cities on the news. It just wasn't a thing that happened in Mont Vernon. And by it not being a thing, I mean crime, violent crime specifically. This was a place that, as cliche as it sounds, everybody knew everybody. Everybody trusted everybody. And, quote, even strangers were united with a mellow trust. Now, it was here that in the early morning hours of October 4th, 2009, and when I say early morning hours, I mean it was like 4 o'clock in the morning, a call came into 911. So the dispatcher answers this call, and they can hear that the person on the other end of the line is speaking very quietly. It's a very soft, very quiet voice, and they can barely make out what the person is saying. But what they're able to deduce from that conversation is that the person on the other end of this line is a child, like a young child, and that they desperately need help. Now, they really didn't know what they were going to be sending officers into, right? They weren't really able to get any information from this kid, but they were like, this is a kid that needs help. So officers were dispatched to the home. Now, when the first officer arrived at the home, they were by themselves. So they start kind of looking at the perimeter of the home, looking at the yard, checking in windows, things like that. And while doing that, they looked inside and they saw something very disturbing through the window. They were able to see through the kitchen window that there was a little girl lying on the kitchen floor, and she was completely covered in blood. So immediately upon seeing this little girl, the cop went to the front door and kicked it down. He was like, back up, be damned. There's a child that needs help. And once inside, he went straight to the girl, and he found that she was alive, but she was in hysterics, okay? She was trying to scream, but no noise was coming out. So she was like silently screaming and just like in a state of panic. And when she was finally able to get herself to be able to speak, she told this cop that her name was Jaimie. The cop then picked Jaimie up and went to take her out of the house because, you don't know what the situation is. You don't know if somebody's still in the house. You just need to get her to safety. So he takes her outside, and when he's taking her out, he asks her if anybody else was in the house. And this is when she tells the cop that, yes, her mother was in the house. Her mother was in the bedroom, but she believed that her, quote, mommy was dead. So in hearing that, he needed to get back inside, right? But he has this hysterical little girl who he's taken outside, but once he tries to put her down, she's like begging him to not leave her. And he tells her like, don't worry, you are safe. I am here with you. I just need to leave you so I can go and see if your mom is safe too. I need to make sure she's okay. So with that, this officer goes back inside. And by the time this is happening, other officers are arriving. So it's not like he just left her completely by herself. So other cops are showing up, they're taking in the scene, and they're looking at this little girl and having more time to comprehend and like notice just how badly she looked. This little girl who, again, she's an 11-year-old child, had a golf ball sized laceration on her head, other cuts to her head, cuts on her inner thigh, her shoulder, and a portion of her right foot had been cut off. When this little girl was asked what happened, what she told police is that 2 bald men that she did not know had come into her house where she was with her mother while they were sleeping. She said one had a knife and one had a bat, and that they had just started attacking the 2 of them in their bed. And Jaimie said the only reason that she was even able to survive is because she had the presence of mind to pretend to be dead. Within no time, the scene was swarming with police. And once they went into this house and they saw what was in this house, they would never be the same. Okay? Officers had went into that home and they had headed to the master bedroom where Jaimie said she had been sleeping with her mother when they were attacked. And they found that that room was covered in blood. And in the bed that was also covered in blood was 42-year-old Kimberly Cates. And she was very clearly deceased after being attacked with a machete. So, Kimberly was born in Toledo, Ohio on March 6, 1967, and I believe she was the only daughter to parents James and Lynette. Now, there isn't a ton of information out there, unfortunately, about Kimberly, especially about her early years. Like, interviews with her friends and family are very scarce. But what I have been able to figure out from finding the little bit of information there is online about her is that she sounded like such like a nice woman. She was said to be the type of person who was super friendly, super outgoing, super encouraging of others. And these were all qualities that really helped her in the line of work that she chose. Because in her life, like her true calling career-wise was nursing. And that's because she had this like just ability to care for people. Kim went above and beyond for her patients. She didn't just treat them for their physical issues. She made sure to answer their questions and calm their fears or anxieties around what was happening with them. She wanted them to know she was safe. This was a safe place. And this was especially true when she was working with kids, right? She would make them feel like they were her own kids. And she'd even reach out to the kids' parents too, because like she was a mom. And as a mom, she understood the like helplessness that parents would feel when something was wrong with their kids. And she wanted to help them through it too. She was able to put others before herself and be compassionate. And, you know, it goes without saying that it takes a very special type of person to do that job. And you know what Kimberly did? And she was said to have done it well. She had graduated from the nursing program at Pima Community College in Tucson and had gone on to work at several different medical centers in Maryland and also New Hampshire, which is where she and her family had finally settled down because of the area's safety and community. And you know, I said it takes a very special person to do the job of being a nurse, and Kimberly was said to be just that, a very special person. She was the type of person who never met a stranger. She was very close with her family. She was very close with her friends. She was even very close with her neighbors. And she was known to being like a devoted and involved mother, always taking an interest and making sure she was there for all of her daughter's school things, extracurriculars. It didn't matter. She was there. Her family said of her, and I quote, "It was impossible for people not to be drawn to her energy, her enthusiasm, and her contagious laughter. She was the life of the party and loved to make people laugh, even at the risk of embarrassing her much quieter husband." Kimberly had met and married her husband. This was a man named David who was an engineer, and they got married in 1997. And a year later, they had their one child, their daughter, Jaimie. And Jaimie was said to be Kimberly's world. Jaimie was such a gift for Kimberly. Being a mother gave her a chance to grow and to change in that role, but it also gave her the ability to see the world through the eyes of a child. She and her daughter were just said to like be so close. They shared a language just their own and like could talk to each other without saying a word rather, by just smiling or hugging. Kimberly was so proud of her daughter and just loved her so much. Family was incredibly important to Kimberly. Besides David and Jaimie, she was incredibly close with her parents, and she loved her brothers, and she saw every single family member as a gift for her. She was the type of person who never missed an opportunity to celebrate those that she loved. Her family said of her, and I quote, "Though petite enough to shop in the children's department for clothing, Kim was larger than life." Her family, her familial unit was her world, and they were said to have been incredibly close. David, by all reports, was a devoted husband and loving father. Jaimie was a bright child, a sixth grader who was super strong and had a black belt in karate. And Jaimie and Kimberly spent most of their free time together, even attending many of the same classes as like a mother-daughter team. And honestly, that makes what happened to them while they were together, alone together, all the more terrifying. So as I mentioned, they lived in Mont Vernon, which was the small community in New Hampshire. And more specifically, they lived on Trow Road. And if you want to get even more specific than that, they lived at 4 Trow Road. And Trow Road was an unpaved road that went throughout an isolated area of Hillsborough County. And to look at photos of this area, the area where this family lived, it looks like a dream. I truly, as somebody from Los Angeles, I cannot imagine living somewhere so beautiful. So let's talk about what happened at 4 Trow Road. David, the husband and father, as I said, was an engineer. And with his job, it took him sometimes out of town. He would do work trips that were elsewhere. I'm sure there's a better way to say that, but my brain is not thinking of it right now. He traveled for work sometimes. That's what I'm trying to say. And that can be a scary thing. Okay, like it doesn't happen for me very often, but my husband, as I've mentioned before, he tattoos, and sometimes that entails going to different states and doing guest spots at other tattoo shops, right? And any time that he has ever gone, I am all nerves. Like being alone with my son in the house and trying to sleep at night when I'm used to having like a dude sleeping next to me for the last, 16 years, it can be very nerve-wracking when he is not here. But in the case of the Cates family, they had an alarm system in their home that would call the police if anything was to happen. And in addition to that, the Cates family was also close with their neighbors. They didn't have like super close neighbors. It's not like sardines on top of each other like it is where I live, but they did have a neighbor, and the neighbor and the Cateses were known to like look out for one another and look out for each other when like David wasn't there. So they did everything they could, right? Everything they could to try to keep themselves safe. Unfortunately, though, there are just some instances where somebody is properly motivated to hurt you, and so they find a way to do that. And that is what happened in this case. So with that, let's move forward to Saturday, October 3rd, 2009. It was on this day that David, the father and the husband, was going to be leaving for a work trip to Maryland. Now, before he left, he did note that the alarm system in their home was on the fritz. Something was up with it, but they hadn't had time to address it, and they didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal, okay? There had never been an issue. It was very unlikely that there would be an issue because, you know, where they lived, how isolated it was, and the low crime rate in the area. So David left on his trip, leaving Kimberly and me home alone. And speaking of that, the crazy thing about this case, because when you hear that, you hear the husband left, the alarm didn't work, the wife and the daughter were home alone. You would think that whoever did this to them was like watching them, right? Casing the place, maybe deactivated the alarm in some way and was just waiting for the opportunity to be able to get these women when David wasn't there. But that wasn't the case. And I think that's what's so either or is very frightening. But this was totally random. They didn't even know that David wasn't there when they went in that house and attacked these two. And I just find that to be so frightening and just like, what are the odds? So it was meant to be a totally normal weekend for mother and daughter. They had some fun plans. They were going to go to the mall together. They were going to go to Jaimie's karate studio. Maybe they hadn't really decided yet. And they were just going to spend some time together. So the night that they were attacked at about 8:30, Kimberly texted David and told him about the plans that they had and then told him good night. And with that, she and her daughter, Jaimie, went to go to sleep, and they slept in Kimberly's bed together. This is something Jaimie liked to do when her father was out of the house. And just based on experience, I imagine that Kimberly felt secure having her daughter next to her. But then we know that Kimberly and Jaimie were attacked in that bed by strangers. So with that, let's get back to the time when police show up at the scene, and this is what they're finding. They're finding these women in this condition, or this woman and this girl in this condition. Well, when it comes to Jaimie, immediately she was rushed to the hospital because just to look at her, they knew that she needed immediate attention. At this point, they didn't even know if she was going to live because she was in such bad shape. And after she's taken off, or at the same time, things are happening simultaneously, police start processing the scene. While inside the home processing the scene, they were able to see that some items had been missing. And this made sense because when Jaimie was talking to police before she was taken to the hospital, she did tell them that one of the men had asked the other one to go and get the jewelry. So that could scream motive, right? That could point them in the direction of motive because they're stealing things. So maybe this could be like a robbery gone wrong. But the way that Jaimie and Kimberly were attacked definitely didn't lend itself towards robbery gone wrong. That didn't seem like the motive. The attack seemed like the motivation here. Now, they were also able to tell that there were two possible points of entry for the house, and that was the basement window, which they found smashed, and the screen lying on the ground next to it. And also in another window, there had been an AC unit, you know, if you've ever had one. You would know. An AC window like sits in an AC unit sits in your window and it has like stuff around it to hold it in. Well, this AC, air conditioner, if you're nasty, had been removed. So they were like, okay, they could have entered there and they could have entered there. Why are they both like that? I cannot say. Well, I can say we will get there, but this is what police are seeing and taking in when they first get to the scene. Outside the home, they also found additional evidence that would be helpful, and that was tracks in the dirt and the mud. They found tire tracks and also footprints that they were able to take impressions of. And that's all good and well, except for that you need to have some suspects that you can take their prints, right? Their footprints, their handprints. Their handprints weren't there. They weren't like on all fours in the mud. But you know what I mean? They need to have something to compare it to, is what I'm trying to say. And it wouldn't take them long to get just that. The day after the murder and attempted murder, 2 young men were brought into the police station to be questioned in relation to Kimberly's murder and Jaimie's attempted murder. And that's because the day of the murders, these 2 dudes had gone to a kickback in a nearby town called Brookline. And while there, they had just casually stated that they had just murdered a woman and her daughter. Now, at the time, in hearing this, the people at this little kickback were like, what? Like, what is your motivation for telling us this? Are you trying to scare people? Are you trying to intimidate people? Is this true, or are you just telling stories? But this was very much a see something, say something situation, and immediately somebody called in and told on these kids. And I say kids, but they weren't both kids. One was underage, though. These 2 kids that had been brought into police were 19-year-old Christopher Gribble, 19-year-old Christopher Gribble, and his friend, 17-year-old Stephen Spader. And both of these men were bald. So let's talk about these 2 dudes a little bit. And let's start with Christopher Gribble, because Christopher being arrested, or rather looked into in relation to this crime, was pretty shocking for a lot of people. And that's because Christopher was known as being like a good kid. He was an upstanding member of society. He had been an Eagle Scout, and while in the Scouts, he had even helped build a shed for the Brookline transfer station. He was a member of the Mormon Church and had even been working towards becoming a literal missionary. Religion and God was so important to him and his family that he had even been homeschooled growing up so that his education could include the proper morals and values that his family wanted him to have and to find to be important and to hold close to his heart. Now this, as we sometimes do see, did seem to stunt Chris socially, because he just didn't get to have a lot of social interactions that other kids would have growing up, from going to school and meeting new people. And because of this, making friends for Chris was nearly impossible, because, you know, he didn't have the social skills to make and maintain friendships, because he just hadn't had a lot of interactions with other people because he was homeschooled. He did have a couple of friends, but they had never really connected with him on any sort of meaningful level, because there was always a little bit of a disconnect between them. It was more of a fun thing, not like a deep thing, because they said that he was just a bit awkward and tended to ramble. Another issue with being homeschooled in Chris's case specifically, and you know what, for the record, because I feel like it could come off as like me dogging on homeschooling, I just wanted to be clear that I have no issue with homeschooling. I actually wish that I had the privilege for that to even be a viable option for myself. Unfortunately, like, it doesn't seem like that's going to be in the cards for me, but I'm only like bringing this up because in Chris's case specifically, it seems to contribute to some of his personality quirks, one may say. But what was I saying? Oh yeah, for Chris, there was another issue with the homeschooling thing for him specifically, because this is a case-by-case basis. I just want that to be clear. But anyway, another issue when it came to Chris being homeschooled is that there weren't any mandated reporters, okay? And this was an issue for Chris because according to him, his mother was abusive, both physically and emotionally. He said that she would spank him, that she would forcibly pin him down to the ground so that she could pop acne that was on his back. And he said that she would make him carry around a vacuum all over the house for a prolonged period of time as a punishment. Now, these allegations have not been confirmed in their entirety, though his mother has come out and stated that on one occasion she did spank him with a utensil. My guess would be a wooden spoon, and that she spanked him with it to the point that it broke. And this is something that she says she regrets and says that she just lost control. And, you know, I do hate that because say what you will. I know some people spank, and I'm not going to get into all of that, but what she is describing is flat out abuse. And it makes me so upset because I just can't imagine hitting your kid. I truly cannot personally. But moving on, according to Chris, because of the way his mother was towards him as he grew up, as he got older, he started to have, quote, dark and twist fantasies about her that he wished he could carry out. Reportedly, he even confessed these thoughts to a counselor while he was at cadet camp. And he straight up told this counselor that he wanted to kill his mom. He wanted to cut her into pieces, and he wanted to make sure that she screamed how he would scream. Now, thankfully, in this case, I don't have to be like, why didn't you tell somebody? Because I feel like when I'm covering these cases, well, that chair made a lot of noise, but I feel like when I'm covering these cases so often, we will be like, you heard somebody say something that fucked up and you did nothing? How is that possible? But that wasn't the situation with this particular counselor. He says this, Chris says this to the counselor, and the counselor's like, why the fuck would he say that? And contacts Chris's parents and Chris's mom, rather, and tells her what he said. And man, can you even imagine how awkward that drive home would be? Because, and getting this information, she had to drive over there and pick him up from this cadet camp and take him back home. And she's just driving along looking over at him like, I'm sorry, you said you wanted to do what to me now? Cut me into pieces? That's fucking crazy, dude, to deal with that. But she did. And then immediately got him to go see a psychiatrist, as one probably should if your kid is talking about cutting you into pieces. And after meeting with the psychiatrist, they determined that Chris did have some traits of somebody suffering from antisocial personality disorder, I believe it is. But at the time, he was too young to get an official diagnosis. They thought his fantasies were weird for sure, but they didn't think that he was going to be a threat to himself or to others. But they were wrong. And can you imagine being his mom, hearing all of this, and then taking him home and having to go to bed at night and put your head on the pillow knowing that somebody who said that about you is just sleeping a few doors down? But no. Scary. No, thank you. Anyways, moving on, this didn't seem to affect the trajectory of his life much, at least not initially. He went from being an Eagle Scout to trying to fulfill his dream of being a Marine. So he's going to be a missionary. He's going to be a Marine. These are all things that sound to most as good things. He enrolled in the U.S. Army Cadet Corps group in Nashua, New Hampshire, and he did well, at least at first. He even won the Academic and Good Conduct Honors Award. But for whatever reason, it all became too much for him, and in 2008, he flunked out of this course. Now, whether it had to do with the fact that he flunked, or maybe he flunked because of, wait a second. Oh, what I'm trying to say here is that he had a massive shift. His energy shifted, what he was interested in shifted, who he was as a person seemed to change. So what I'm trying to say is maybe this change happened because he flunked, or maybe he flunked because he had this massive change. But either way, those two things happened. He changed and he flunked. Now, Chris, he had a friend. This friend's name was Steven Spader, and this is the same Steven Spader who was arrested or taken in for questioning alongside Chris in relation to Kimberly's murder and Jaimie's attack. Now, Steven and Chris had actually met when they were kids. I think they even met in the Boy Scouts, but as they got older, they had, went separate ways and had just recently reconnected and become friends again in 2009. So Steven, like Chris, did have some issues growing up, but his were noticeably different, okay? He was born to a mother who had addiction problems. She used drugs before she was pregnant, while she was pregnant, after she gave birth, and when Steven was born, he did have drugs in his system. And after he was born, his mother either surrendered him or he was taken from her. It sounded more like a surrender situation to me, but it was a little bit vague. And he ended up being adopted by his parents, the Spaders. This was Christine and Steven. He was named for his adopted father, yes. And he was adopted when he was just 5 days old. Now, even though Chris and Steven had both had challenging beginnings to life, they did have a lot of differences. And notably, their differences came in their social skills. Chris had none. We've already discussed that, but Stephen didn't seem to have that problem. He came from a loving and nurturing family who literally went out and chose him, and he was a happy kid. He was personable, he was outgoing, he played sports, he was in theater, and making friends just came easy to him. At least when he was younger. Once his teenage years came upon him, once he became a teenager, things changed. Stephen was said to have become cold and difficult for his parents to control. The once happy and energetic boy was now sad and emo and troubled. He wanted to be a drug dealer. Aspirations. He wanted to be a drug dealer. He wanted to be in a gang. He even said that he was a member of the Crips, which I do not believe. And he was said to want to commit some legit crimes. Which was odd because he literally came from a home that could and would give him anything he wanted, but he just wanted more. It seemed like doing things wrong, being in trouble was what he wanted. He would even steal his parents' car without permission. He would take it. He would take money. Then he would go and buy and use and sell drugs. And on top of that, around this time, he also ended up having a terrible temper. He would have aggressive mood swings that would come out of absolutely nowhere. And people knew this about him. Friends and family knew what he was like and were careful with what they would do and say when he was around. He would literally punch holes in the wall at home during fits of rage. And in one altercation with his father, he even pulled a knife on him. He was drifting away from his usual friends. He was staying away from home. Most of his friends were kids that went to other high schools that he didn't go to. And speaking of high school, actually, he didn't even end up finishing high school. He had dropped out of Brookline High School, I believe is what it was. And he ended up just getting his GED. His parents were worried about him. They really just did not know what to do. So they too took him to see a psychiatrist. And this was in 2006. And they spent thousands of dollars to try to get him help, and he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and major depression. In addition to therapy, they also enrolled him in an addiction treatment center because he admitted that he was using both prescription drugs and non-prescription drugs, illegal drugs. And once he was in this treatment center, they realized that he was going to be needing more help than they were equipped to handle. So he ended up being switched over to a residential treatment center, but that too was short-lived because after just a month, he just decided he was going to leave. So he had, his short stays in psychiatric hospitals, but he was always released unhelped and continued with his destructive behavior. He even ran away once, but ended up being found in New York just days later and was returned back to his parents. And it was just like a cycle. So these are the two guys. That little backstory is the backstory on the two guys who on Monday, October 5th, 2009, were brought in by police and questioned in relation to Kimberly's murder and Jaimie's attack. The two boys were questioned separately, and they were both asked what they had done that Saturday. And according to Chris, he had woken up at 10 a.m. and he had plans that day of hitting up a few yard sales with his friend Steven Spader. He said that the two went to a few yard sales but didn't really find anything worth anything, so he dropped Steven off at home. He said it was Saturday, so that evening they did have plans to get together, but they didn't have anything specific planned. They thought that maybe they would just go to the Walmart parking lot and hang out, which parking lot hangs. If you know, you know, and if you don't, explaining it really isn't going to help much. But anyways, this is where he said he planned to go with Steven. They were going to go to this parking lot, and once there, they were going to meet up with a couple of friends. One of these friends was 19-year-old William Marks, who went by Billy. We'll call him Billy throughout this video. And 17-year-old Quinn Glover. My brain wants to say Donald Glover. And I say that these guys were all friends, but it's like they were and they weren't, because Chris and Billy had actually just met. They were very recent friends. But either way, all these guys were planning to get together and just sort of dick around in a parking lot. So he says that he and Steven got to Walmart and they waited there and met up with Billy a little bit later. Or rather, more specifically, he said that him and Steven were hanging out, but he wouldn't say with 100% certainty that they were at Walmart. Just in general, he said that he couldn't really remember the day. Even though it was just 2 days before, he couldn't remember much of what happened or where they were because he hadn't committed the day to memory since it was just like a normal day for him. And honestly, that was just kind of his energy through the entire questioning. He would answer questions, but be just vague enough so that he wasn't locking himself into any answers that he couldn't change later, is the vibe that he was giving. So he says they're dicking around at Walmart. Maybe he can't be sure how long they were there, what time they were there. He also says that he knows that at some point they went over to his friend, 19-year-old Autumn's house. And when they were there, they watched Dexter together, which sounds like just such a good time. Such a good time to hang out with friends and watch Dexter. I love Dexter. I actually just finished watching for the first time the new season, the Dexter Original Sin, which was fine. Here's the thing about me. I'm going to tell you a secret. Fun fact for you. I will allow Dexter to hurt me again and again and again. Just give me more episodes. Thank you. And Chris seemed to be really into the show too. I don't want to say that me and Chris have anything in common because I don't think I'm anything like this piece of shit, but he was really into Dexter. He said specifically he found Dexter's character to be fascinating because of the fact that he was a blood spatter analyst who worked for Miami Metro, as we all know if we've seen Dexter, and then he was also seemingly controlled by blood and a serial killer. Which, I guess is fascinating to an extent. I don't know what it is about Dexter for me. I find it to be more entertaining than fascinating. Like, I don't look at it quite as deeply as perhaps Chris did, because Chris, was interested in killing, but we will get there. I just love Michael C. Hall, man. I've loved Michael C. Hall since he was David Fisher in 6 Feet Under. Anyways, Chris tells this cop that he and his friends watched a couple of hours of Dexter, and then he and Steven left and decided to go and sleep in his car. And the cop who was interviewing him thought this was weird and was like, why did you go and sleep in your car? Like, why didn't you just sleep inside the house that you were just at? Like, why didn't you just have like a little slumber party? And he said that there were only 2 couches, so there wouldn't have been anywhere for them to sleep. So they went and slept in the car because they thought they would be more comfortable, which I can't imagine anything less comfortable than sleeping in a car at this particular moment. But he said, you know what? The car holds heat well. He said that the 2 left Autumn's house at between 7 and 8 a.m. And then he went and dropped Steven back off at home with plans to pick him up again at 1:30 to hit up some more yard sales. Apparently, these guys were very into going to yard sales, or so that's what Chris would like you to believe. And it's because they were really trying to find something to sell. I guess they needed some money to buy some weeds, so they were going to all these yard sales to get some stuff to sell. And they did say that they did find one particular score at one yard sale where they were able to get a bunch of jewelry for just $20 that they then promptly went and sold. And this is something, a part of the story that Steven, because remember, he's being questioned at the same time, Steven confirms the jewelry getting and selling story. But back to Christopher, because we're still kind of going through his timeline. We're going to bounce back and forth a little bit, but right now we're focusing on Chris. And police tell him, like, hey, or they ask him rather, hey, how would you feel if you found out that we're talking to other people at the same time we're talking to you, and their stories differ from yours a bit? And then they tell him, like, listen, I need you to sit and think long and hard on what you did this weekend, starting with Saturday night. The cop's like, what did you do? What did you do after you left your girlfriend's party? Because I guess he had a little girlfriend who had a party there. And they're like, what did you do after you left that party? And he said, like, I thought I went home. I could have promised that I went home, but maybe I went out with Steve. The police don't really buy what Chris is saying, though, right? They're not buying what he's selling. They're not picking up what he's putting down. So they straight up ask him, like, hey, what do you know about what happened in Mont Vernon on Saturday? And he says that all he knows is what he's seen online, because he says that he specifically went on the computer and looked up the Telegraph, which is like a news publication, and looked to see what was going on. Interesting. And he said that he saw that a lady was killed and that a little girl had been taken to the hospital. And his excuse for why he was looking into this is that somebody he knew, he couldn't remember who or like what, but somebody he knew had texted him or called him, couldn't really remember how they contacted him, and had told him, though, that the little girl who was attacked had been like in the same class as one of their siblings, basically. Chris said that he knew this little girl had to be young, like 10 years old if they were in the class with the sibling, and said that he hoped that she would be okay, and said that this would be a very terrible thing. This was a very terrible thing to do to a little girl. He then said that the situation bothered him. It didn't bother him as much as it may bother somebody who knew the girl personally, but it still bothered him, which that note stuck out to me because if you recall, just like a week or 2 ago, I covered the case, which was the murder of Kaya Campbell. And in that video where I was discussing it, I talked about how Aiden Zelmer, the 15-year-old who killed her, was asked like how he would feel if she was gone, if she wasn't found. And he said like, oh, it would bother me, but not as much as somebody who cared about her more. And I was like, wow, that's such a guilty statement to say. And now here we have Chris saying the exact same thing. But That is what he said. And they said that if somebody had targeted these women specifically and had gone there with the intent to hurt them, that would rub against his conscience specifically, personally. And then he said specifically of this quote, I am one of those type of gentlemanly chivalry sort of guys that don't even hit girls, let alone go out and treat them badly. If the girl's in the hospital, she obviously got injured or something. And when the cop heard this, he's like, it's funny you mention it, and I'm glad that you mention it because it gives me the opportunity to tell you that thankfully this little girl is going to be okay. She's going to survive what happened to her. And in response to this, Chris said like, oh, that's good. And the cop's like, oh yeah, I know that's good because this little girl deserves to be alive and her mother deserved to be alive. And then the cop said, you want to know why else it's so good that she's alive besides the fact that just like her being alive is a good thing? And then he said, it's because now she will be able to help us identify the people who attacked her and killed her mother. And in response to this, Chris is like, oh yeah, man, like that's good. I'm so glad you have her to be able to help you. But if you're actually watching this interview, because you can watch it online, you can watch his interrogation, you can tell that that's the first time that he didn't sound especially confident with his answer. The cop then asks him, like, okay, let's say this was a robbery gone wrong and these people went in there and they attacked this woman and this child, but that wasn't their intent. And Chris said that he would think that those were very nasty people. And then the cop asked him, like, what do you think should happen to such nasty people? And he said, well, I think that they should probably go to prison for the rest of their lives. So it's around this point that Chris is starting to suspect that people, by people, I mean police, are suspecting him specifically as being involved with this, which I feel like he probably felt that way as soon as he was arrested. But during his interview, you can like kind of see like in his thought process, it feels like what he's saying is a stream of consciousness from within his head where he's trying to understand like how they're on to him. And he's kind of saying it out loud because he says to the cop like, seems to me that what has led you to me and the reason I'm here being questioned by you is my car. And the cop's like, why would you think that your car would lead us to you? And he says like, oh, well, maybe there was a car that was seen near the scene of the murder that matches the description of my car. So then you just somehow ended up coming to me specifically. And then he says of this, quote, it's quite possible I was in the area. I could have been driving down that road right when it happened, which kind of scares me. Because what if they'd come out of the house and needed a getaway car and killed me for my car? That kind of makes me nervous. I probably won't drive around there too much anymore. And I just feel like that is such a thing to say for so many reasons. But one of them that's notable is that this guy has gone from barely being able to remember where he was that night. Like, oh, I was at Walmart. I was at Autumn's. I think I was here. I think I was there. To all of a sudden remembering, oh, I was perhaps. He's still saying perhaps actually. But it's like, I don't know where I was. And then, it's possible I was on that road at the exact time the murder was being committed. It could be. To quote Angels in the Outfield, it could happen. Now, immediately upon Chris going down this line of questioning, the cop just jumps on it. It was like, okay, so let's say you were on the road at the time the murder was being committed. Let's say you were on their road at the time the murder was being committed. And he straight up jumps in and is like, well, that would scare me shitless. Like, that would scare me shitless because not only has it made me a suspect. I mean, look, I'm sitting here being questioned by you right now. But also, if this person had come out, they definitely would have killed me for my car. Because anyone who would do that to a woman and a little kid would absolutely do that to me too. And from there, he goes on to give the police more specific information about where he may have been that night. He says that he and Steven left their area, which was Brookline, and headed to Mont Vernon, and they were just driving around. They like to just drive around and take in the scenes. It was something that they enjoyed to do together. So they're just driving around when after a while they go down this secluded road and park their car in like the driveway of somebody's house so they could turn around. Essentially, though he couldn't remember the exact street name and couldn't point out the house if he had a gun to his head. He just could not remember that. But he says they stop there and then they get out to use the restroom. And by use the restroom, I mean piss outdoors. And in telling the cop this story, he is literally putting both he and Steven near the scene of the murder at the time the murder is being committed instead of putting them at their friend Autumn's house watching their little freaking binge session of the Dexter TV series. Now remember, at the same time Chris is being questioned, they're also questioning Steven. And at the same time his questioning is ramping up, so is Steven's. And the cop who's questioning Steven straight up asked him, like, hey, is there any way that early on Sunday morning, you, Chris, and Billy were in Mount Vernon. I keep saying Mount, it's Mont Vernon. And Steven's like, fuck no, bitch, me? I never would. I was not. And the cop's like, that's funny that you're saying that because we're getting different information from other people because we actually have Billy in another room. We're questioning him and he is telling us everything. And now you may remember that Billy was their friend that they were planning to meet and hang out with at the Walmart parking lot. Remember that guy? We'll get into him in a little bit. And hearing this information, Steven starts to get a little bit panicked and he tells the cop, like, I feel like I need a lawyer because you guys are starting to accuse me of things. And the cop tells him it's more about gathering information than accusing. Like, if you want an attorney, that's fine. All you have to do is say, like, quote, I want an attorney. But right now we're just trying to get information from you. And Steven, instead of actually asking straight up for an attorney, just says that he wants to leave. And the cop tells him, like, I'm sorry, bro, but you cannot leave because we have enough evidence now to place you at the scene of the crime. And he just says that that's bullshit, that he shouldn't be kept there, that he came with police voluntarily because according to him, he came with police voluntarily, and that he just wanted to leave. He wanted to go out. He wanted to smoke a cigarette because he didn't do anything wrong. So speaking of smoking, let's actually go back to Chris for a second. The cops are talking to Chris and they start to bring up Steven. And they're like, hey, so your relationship with Steven, how loyal are you to him? Would you be the type of person who would follow him into a weird or compromising position and just deal with the consequences later? Is that kind of the vibe between the two of you? And Chris says no, that he wouldn't do that he didn't put up with bullshit from anyone. And then he even went on to try to say, and this is where the smoking thing comes into play, he tried to say, like, he wasn't like too much of a prude. If there was like an 18-year-old who wanted to smoke a cigarette, he wouldn't be the one to say no. And it's like, first off, nobody would. What teenager is going to stop their underage friend from smoking a cigarette? Virtually zero. This is not an episode of Seventh Heaven. We are not in a sitcom, my guy. And the cop seems to feel the same way. The cop's like, listen, that is literally not what we're talking about. I don't think you're taking in the seriousness of the situation. I don't think you are seeing the big picture here. You are here for a reason. You specifically are here being questioned for a reason. He tells them, like, we've got other guys here that we are questioning and they're talking and they're not talking about underage cigarettes. So how about you, Chris, pull your head out of your ass and start giving me some information? Because quite frankly, this is not looking good for you. So Chris again tries to deflect, and the cop at this point is just done. It's like, okay, here's where it is. Here's where we're at. I need you to tell me what part you played and what happened on Saturday night. Straight up. What's up? And Chris is like, oh my God, you think we had something to do with that? You think we, grasping his pearls, had something to do with that? The cop straight up says, like, I think you know something that happened. I think you know who did something, and I need you to tell me now. Again, Chris is like, you really think we did this? And the cop's like, well, did you tell anyone you did? And he's like, absolutely not. Why would I tell anyone I did this? And he's like, so you're telling me if I have somebody here who's telling me that you said you cut this little girl's throat, they're lying. And he's like, yes, I would never hurt a girl, let alone a child, because, quote, that would be horrible. The cop then asked Chris, why did you go into that house? Why did you guys go into that house? And said at this point, it's not a question of if, it's a question of why. And that's because at this point, it's not just Chris and Steven who are being questioned. They're also questioning Billy. They're also questioning Quinn, the two kids who were supposed to meet them at Walmart that night. And they're questioning Autumn, the guy whose house they had the Dexter viewing party at. And all of these people are not being quite as tight-lipped because they had less involvement, not no involvement, less involvement, and everything to lose. So since they have been talking to these other guys, they were able to get additional information to bring into the interrogation room with Chris and Steven. So they do just that. They go to Chris and they're like, hey, I need you to tell me who/what is the Disciples of Destruction, or the DOD. But I'm sure I'll still call it the Disciples of Destruction because I'll forget that I was going to call it the DOD. And this was a, quote, gang that was created by either Chris or Steven. And this gang was him, Chris, Steven, Billy, and their friend Quinn. And they were, quote, drawn together by their shared interests with dark themes. They not only admired the Manson family and the Zodiac killer, but they were self-proclaimed juggalos, which if you're not sure what a juggalo is, that just means that you're a fan of ICP, which is the Insane Clown Posse, which I don't know if they're still a group, but they were like a white rap group known for their, quote, celebration of violence and mayhem. This is actually the second case that I've covered ever that I can recall where the killers consider themselves to be juggalos, which does not bode well for the juggalos, which I can say for the record, I was never an ICP fan, but I knew some ICP fans, especially when I was like in high school. I knew several, and they're like fine people, just not these ones. Just overall juggalos are fine. These juggalos, not so fine. And, you know, also come to think of it, this is the second case in recent weeks where we discussed some stupid little murder cult, murder gang, remember? Because when I covered Luke Woodham, that was like, if I'm filming this now, it was like last week or the week before, there were the Croth kids. Remember the kids of the Croth? Where in that case, it was like devil worshipping in a cult. In this case, it's like a little street gang. But with DOD and the Croth, ugh, it's just dumb. It's just dumb. But anyways, this gang, the DOD, the DOD was formed in September of 2009. So literally the year of these murders, just right before they went on to do what they did. And they wanted to create a sense of brotherhood. Like, that's why they did this. And they wanted to get money, obviously. And they believed in loyalty and violence. And the only way in this gang was to commit a crime. And specifically, they'd have to break into a house and kill whoever was in there. Their way of initiating someone into this gang was spilling innocent blood. But, you know, we know this now. This is information we now know because the case is done, it's been solved, and the information is out there. But at the time that Chris is being questioned about this, he is being far less forthcoming with information. And the cop is done, dude. They've lost their patience. They lay into them. You can tell that he is pissed. And he tells them, like, okay, we know you were there. We know you took jewelry from that house. We know you didn't get a bunch of jewelry at a yard sale that you then pawned for money. You stole a bunch of money from a house after you murdered a woman, and that's the jewelry that you sold. And the cop is telling him this because by this time, they already know, dude. They already know that jewelry was stolen from Kimberly's house at the time she was killed. And they had already confirmed that Chris and Steven had gone to a cash for gold store and had sold all they were able to sell, getting a whopping $130. And you know what's really crazy here about this whole story is that while Chris and Steven were actually at the cash for gold store selling the jewelry that they had stolen from Kimberly's house after they murdered her, they were stopped by a cop for looking suspicious. And the cop is like, hey, you know, there's been several robberies, both in Mont Vernon and also in Brookline, and you guys are young with jewelry, and that's weird. And they're just like, what? That's fucking crazy, man. I can't believe somebody would do that. Now I'm going to bid you adieu. And they were just able to go because, I mean, he's suspicious, but he doesn't know that they did anything. Moving on, they then question Chris about the river and about items that he may or may not have thrown in the river. And at first he denies it. He denies even seeing a river in recent memory. He's like, rivers? What's that? Water? Like the ocean, but smaller? Never heard of it. And eventually he does admit to knowing what a river is and going to a river, though he won't admit why he was there. And that's because the reason he is there is because he had been disposing of evidence, obviously. And the reason we know this is because at the same time he's being questioned and Steven's being questioned, their friend Autumn. Remember Autumn? There's so many people in this. I'm sorry. I should have like a diagram. I'll try to make one when I edit this footage. But Autumn is like, hey, yeah, they were throwing evidence in the river. I was actually with them. And Autumn tells them that like Steven and Chris had gone to the river and had thrown evidence from the murder in the river, though Autumn said at the time it was happening, he didn't really know what was going on. But back to Chris. The cop looks at Chris and is like, how could you? How could you hack away at a little girl like that? How could you do that when you heard her screams? Did you like it? Were you smiling while you attacked her? You are an animal. He called Chris a sick animal, and then he told him that the other guys that were present during the murders, and yes, you heard me right, the other guys, plural, who were present during the murder didn't even know it was going to happen. They just thought that they were breaking into a house to steal some jewelry to pawn. But not Chris. They knew that Chris had gone in there with a weapon and a plan. And that plan was to kill someone. They then told Chris that he killed Kimberly and he liked it. He liked it until the lights came on and he was confronted with the harsh reality of what he had actually done. When Chris was asked if he would apologize to Jaimie for what had happened to her and what had happened to her mother, he said that if he was the one responsible for it, he would have apologized. And at this point, he decides that he's not going to talk anymore. So there is a slight pause in his interrogation. He does change his mind. About an hour later, he decides to talk and he gives so much more information. But for now, he's stopped talking. So we're going to move on to someone else. Let's talk about Billy, because as I said, he was there and he was being questioned. And when I was first looking into this case, I was like, why would Billy, like, I could see why Billy would be questioned, of course, because like he knew them and everything, but why would we be focusing on what Billy's saying, considering this whole time Chris and Stephen have just been saying that it was the two of them together? So what could Billy really add to the story that would be substantial? And it turns out a lot, because Billy was actually there at the time of the murder, and it didn't take very much pushing to get him to spill just literally all of the beans. Billy tells the cops that he was there. He was at Kimberly and Jaimie's home the night of the murder, and he was there with Chris, he was there with Stephen, and he was there with Quinn. They were all there. He said the night of the murder, Stephen had reached out to him around midnight and asked him if he'd want to hang out, and he's like, sure, why not? So he goes over to Walmart where he meets Stephen, and then they walk over and meet Chris. They all get into Chris's car, and they drive over to Quinn's house, and Quinn was reportedly not happy to see them. Apparently Quinn, had talked to Chris earlier that day and knew that that evening Chris wanted to commit a robbery, and Quinn said he wasn't sure he wanted to participate in that. But Stephen that night was able to convince him, and by convince him, I want to say force, but like he is, 17 years old, not an adult, but old enough to make his decisions, but he was definitely pressured into it. So Stephen texts him a couple of times. Stephen calls him a couple of times. And finally he gets him on the phone. He's like, sneak out of your fucking house, dude. And he's like, oh, I can't. I already tried it. My dad caught me, which he didn't. He hadn't even tried. He just told him this because he didn't want to go. And Stephen told him, like, listen, I don't care. I don't care if your dad caught you. I don't care if you have to walk right past him out the front door. You're coming out with us tonight. And so Quinn reluctantly agreed and came out with them, even bringing an extra pair of gloves per their request. But anyways, back to Billy. Billy said that once all of them were together in Chris's car, they drove over to Mont Vernon. He said everybody was sober, everybody had their wits about them, but he said he didn't know why they were going to that area. He didn't know why they had chosen that house specifically, which we know now that that's a lie, that he was just lying, because what he left out during this part of the questioning is that he and Stephen had previously actually been the ones driving around looking for a house to rob, had chosen Mont Vernon specifically. Okay, he left that out. He also left out the fact that he had a pocket knife that he was taking out and showing people and telling people that he was planning to use. But, Billy is divisive, I think. During his initial questioning, he played dumb, and he just said that Stephen had told him that they were going to go out and try to make some money. That's what he thought they were doing that night. When asked what actually happened that night, he said that he had blocked a lot of it out because it was too traumatic to remember. But the cops did eventually get him to remember something. They got him to admit to being in the room when the murder took place, and got him to admit to actually seeing Kimberly and Jaimie after the attack, after the lights were turned on. But he said he was just there. That was his only involvement. He did not participate. Billy claims that he had no idea that Chris and Stephen were planning to kill somebody. He said that his entire understanding was that they were going to this house to rob somebody, and that if people had been there, they were going to be tied up and chloroformed. Okay, and this is something that Autumn actually sort of corroborates, because he tells police that at some point Stephen had gone to him and had asked him if he, Autumn, could make chloroform for him, Stephen. And for whatever reason, Autumn was like, yeah, no problem. I don't see a problem with this at all. It's not weird at all. He said that Stephen just had dark interests. He was the kind of kid who had the books, The Anarchist and the Terrorist Cookbook. So since this was something that he was interested in, he never really took anything Stephen said or did that was like odd like this as being as odd as it was, because he was just kind of this guy that had weird interests and was all talk. He said that Stephen was the kind of guy who would tell these grandiose stories that were very elaborate and detailed, but often or always unverifiable. He said Stephen would always talk about shooting people or stabbing people or wanting to kill someone to see what it felt like, and told Autumn, like, you have no idea what I'm capable of. But when Autumn looked at him, he just saw a troubled kid. The only thing Steve ever really did say that made Autumn go, that seems a little legit, is that he would often talk about killing his mother. This is something that, as we know, he and Chris had in common, and he and Chris would often sit and talk about wanting to kill their mothers, which is very disturbing when we think about the fact that they very seriously could have, because look at what they're capable of. Now, speaking of Chris, let's get back to his interrogation. So once Chris realized that the police knew, the police were on to him, they knew what had happened, they were talking to everybody else, he had no way of talking his way out of this situation, he decided he was just going to confess. And confess he did. He started by telling the police that he and Stephen, very similar people. Very, very similar. They had similar upbringings, even though I would argue that they didn't really have similar upbringings. Maybe they had similar trauma from their upbringings, but he said they were similar. They had similar upbringings, and he said that they were both sociopaths. He said the way that the murder ended up happening is that the two boys knew that they wanted to commit a robbery. They didn't know how, they didn't know who, they didn't know when, they just knew they wanted it to happen soon. They wanted some money, they wanted to get some stuff to steal, some stuff to pawn. So they were just kind of waiting for opportunity to strike. And strike it did, because on Saturday, Stephen contacted Chris and told him, hey, I found this perfect house. And this is the house that he and Billy found when they were out scouting the neighborhoods. And this house was actually Kimberly's neighbor's house in Mont Vernon. Chris said that he and Stephen had decided that they would go to this house, they would break in, they would steal whatever they wanted. And if anybody was in the house at the time this happened, they'd have some fun with them and kill them too. And he said specifically of this, and I quote, I'll be perfectly honest. I've wanted to kill someone for a long time. It's like an urge. And it was kind of like the time I could get it out. And Chris said it didn't matter if these people resisted or not, even if they complied. He just wanted to kill somebody, which is very scary. Chris is obviously very dangerous, self-proclaimed. And we know from talking, well, I didn't talk to anybody. We know from statements from many, many people that Stephen was also very dangerous too. When Quinn was being questioned, he told the police about Stephen's urges to hurt people and about how Stephen would sort of try to figure out if other people felt the same way so that he could have people in his corner. He said that the questions around this and what Quinn would be willing and capable of doing started slow. He said first Stephen would kind of ask him about if he'd be willing to commit crimes with him. And then it moved on to, would you commit robberies? Would you go into people's houses with me? Would you steal something for me? And then, would you kill someone for me? And it turns out he thought that Quinn would. So from everybody's stories that they gave police, they were able to put together a timeline of what happened that night. And basically on Saturday, the four boys got into Chris's car and they headed to Kimberly's address. They headed to 4 Trow Road. According to Chris, everybody knew what was happening, which is something that they'll dispute later. But he said everybody knew what was happening and everybody was down to play their parts. Billy and Quinn were coming along. I don't know if they had agreed to take part in it, but they knew what was happening or was coming along. Okay? Did they know what was happening? You'll have to tell me what you think, but this is what Chris was saying. And Autumn, who did not come along, had agreed to be their alibi. Chris said that all the boys in the car, him, Stephen, Quinn, and Billy all had pocket knives. And he said that Chris had also brought a machete that had belonged, I believe, to his father. And he brought this because he knew that Stephen liked machetes and they were planning to do this thing together. He said that he also brought a Boy Scout pocket knife that had 4 to 5 inches of blade. It's a weird way to say it, but it was like a 4 to 5 inch long blade on a pocket knife. And he brought this because he liked it. He liked it because of how it looked and because it had a leather case. So they drove to Trow Road, and on the way, Stephen said to the car of boys, and I quote, "We're about to do the most evil thing that this town has ever seen." Now, it's super tragic here is, one, they're accurate. They did do the most evil thing that this town has ever seen. And the thing that's just like mind-boggling about this to me is like Kimberly's house wasn't even their initial plan. I mentioned this earlier, but they were actually planning to break into Kimberly's neighbor's house. Okay. And they ended up changing their mind at the last minute because they thought that it was too big of a home and it would be too complicated for them once they were inside. So they defaulted to going to Kimberly's house where she happened to be alone with her child and with an alarm system that didn't work at that time. Anyways, Chris dropped the boys off at Kimberly's house and then he drove around to find a parking spot before going back and meeting them at the home where Kimberly and her daughter were sleeping. They look at the house and they start trying to figure out how they're going to get inside. And they decide what they're going to do is enter through a basement window. So they smash the window, they remove the screen, and they realize that they are all too big to actually fit through there, or rather all of them except for Billy. Billy was the smallest of the group. He was like 5'2" and like about 100 pounds. He was a very small, petite young man. So they put Billy inside this window. And once he gets inside, like to the basement, he realizes that he can't get through to the house because the door is locked. But it turns out, and I just had to add this even though it doesn't really matter because it just shows that these are like dumb children, even though I think Billy was like 19, so he's an adult. But either way, he isn't locked. It's not locked. He wouldn't be locked. The door was not locked. It was just a pull door and not a push door. So he didn't know. And he was just like pushing this pull door and couldn't get it open. And I was like, of course. So Billy's there, stuck in the basement, and the guys are like, okay, what are we gonna do? And they realize that there's an AC unit in one of the windows. So they're like, okay, we can just take this out and enter through the window. So they do just that, or rather, Steven does that. They remove the AC. Steven enters the house through the window where the AC unit was. He goes to the back door. He opens it. He lets Chris and Quinn into the house, and then they collectively go and get Billy out of the basement where he was stuck. Now, near the front door, the boys found a breaker box, and they actually flipped the breaker to turn off the power because they thought that the alarm system would monitor, like the motion sensors would be able to monitor them in the house, and they didn't want that to happen. And from there, they just went through the house and started looking for things to steal. And in one of the rooms, and I believe this was Jaimie's room, they found an iPod. And they used this iPod as like a little flashlight, which the picture of this is so horrifying in my brain because it's the middle of the night. It's a secluded area, as we know, so it was like pitch black in there. And there are these guys walking down this hallway with an iPad, an iPod as their light source as they're heading towards the master bedroom where Kimberly and Jaimie were asleep in their bed. When Steven opened the door to that bedroom, he looked with the light from the iPod and he saw the two forms sleeping in the bed. And he turned to the other guys and said, "There are people in here." And at first they heard him wrong and they thought he said there were not people in there. So they sort of had a moment of like calm. But that was very short-lived because since Steven was shining the light on the bed, it ended up waking up Kimberly. And she said out loud, quote, "Jaimie, is that you?" It was at this point that the boys jumped into action and both Chris and Steven ran to the bed, with one of them being on one side and one being on the other, Chris holding a knife and Steven holding a machete. At this point, Kimberly was sitting up in the bed. She was very confused as to what was going on. She was asking, like, who's there? What is happening? And she reached for the lamp on her bedside table. And that's when, according to Chris, Steven flipped out and started swinging the machete into the bed like a baseball bat. Now, Chris says that in response to Steven swinging the machete, the women started to scream. Kimberly and her daughter started to scream, obviously, and he believes that the first swing actually missed them and that they just started freaking out because in the middle of the night, in the dark, they feel somebody swinging and hitting something in the bed. So Steven then swings the machete again. This time he does hit Kimberly, and Chris is like, okay, we're doing this, and he jumps in the bed and stabs her several times in the chest with the knife. It's just so horrific to think about because they were literally asleep. This is what they woke up to. Okay, and they were just this little woman, this little girl, they were both under 100 pounds, and they wake up to these men on either side of them attacking them with a machete and a knife. Chris said that when he was committing these crimes, he felt very controlled, that he didn't really feel much of anything, which surprised him because he thought he would. But he said that Steven seemed to be having a different experience. He seemed to be completely in it and like he lost it. Chris said that while Steven was, quote, hacking away at the mother, Jaimie actually did try to run because remember, her mom told her to try to run, to try to hide. So she tried to jump out of the bed and ended up actually jumping into Chris's arms, which I can't even imagine the logistics of this, but this is what he said. He said in response to this, he swung the knife towards her, towards like her head. He doesn't know where he hit her, but he stabbed at her. And then he took her and he swung her and like threw her and slammed her into the sliding glass door. And at that moment, all of her screaming and crying stopped. And he said that he believed that she was, quote, probably toast. And as far as Kimberly, Steven had completely brutalized her. Like it's horrific. And she was unfortunately alive for most of her wounds, which is so difficult to know and think about. But once he was finally done with his basically beating her overhead, he pulled back her head and he cut her throat. Chris said that he had watched all of this. He had heard Kimberly's gurgling sounds. He had seen Steven hacking away at her the way he was. And he said that watching Steven do this and the ferociousness that he had in him even scared him a little bit. Chris said that he thought he would feel bad. He was sort of sorry that he didn't, is what he said. And he said that he didn't know why he didn't feel bad. He said that he thought that he would at least like puke or something, especially when he, and this is graphic, when he, quote, saw Kimberly's forearm open with the bone showing. Or when he heard the, quote, little girl crying and saying, please don't do this, and her mother comforting her. So Kimberly is comforting her daughter while she's being attacked with this machete and is probably thinking in the back of her mind, like, I hope they don't hurt my child. Like, why would they hurt a child? But there's nothing she can do to protect her. And Chris said that after doing this, he doesn't know if he has a conscience considering how little he cared. And on top of that, on top of not caring about doing this in this instance, they also had plans to do this again. Him and Stephen had talked about the fact that this time around, they didn't get the opportunity to torture anyone because of how fast the attack was, but that next time they would make time for that. And this seemed like something that not only Chris wanted to do, but Stephen definitely wanted to do too, because later when Quinn testified at Stephen's trial, he said that Stephen, quote, wanted to break into houses, steal stuff, kill people, stay the night, and make scenes for the press with their bodies. He talked about eating people, roasting people, putting heads on stakes, and making scenes for the press. Chris said that Stephen was the type of guy who enjoyed the butchering. He liked the power that taking a life gave him and the drawn-out experience. But for him, for Chris, he was more of a precision guy. If he went into a place to kill somebody, he was just going to do it. And he said of this quote, Steve was pretty excited. It definitely wasn't his first time. He was like, yeah, it's awesome. You'll get used to it, Chris. It gets addicting, but we'll take care of it. Chris said that Stephen told him this was not his first time killing somebody. He said that Stephen said that he had killed several people and said that this instance with Kimberly and Jaimie wasn't even the first set of mother and daughter that he had attacked. Chris said that after he had thrown Jaimie into that sliding glass door and Stephen was done with what he was doing to Kimberly, he approached Jaimie on the floor and kicked her several times with his steel-toed boot, and then swung down the machete at her head, or at least that it looked like he was aiming for her head. Chris said at this point, he started backing out of the room because of the rage that Stephen was exhibiting. He said that this scared him and that he, quote, looked just like Jason from Halloween. And I want it to be clear that that is a quote. I obviously know that Jason wasn't in Halloween. That was Michael Myers. But that's what he said. And he also said at this point he was freaking out. He told Stephen, like, calm down, dude, it's me. It's me. And he could see Stephen start to soften. Now, I've talked about Chris and I've talked about Stephen, but let's talk about Billy and Quinn, because when this was happening, they were there. Billy apparently was standing in the doorway just watching what was happening, but Quinn was unable to watch. He ended up leaving the room. He covered his ears, he closed his eyes, and he tried to get away from the sound of Jaimie and Kimberly screaming, but he was unable to completely drown it out because of how loud it was. And he remembers Kimberly saying to the boys, quote, you don't have to do this. Please stop. So Quinn, he had left the room and he had actually ended up going to the front room where, if you remember, that's where the breaker box was. And after he stopped hearing the sounds in the room, he turned the breaker box back on. He flipped it. So the lights went on in the house. Because remember, all of this was happening in the dark. So he flips the switch, the lights come on, and he is able to basically be the one that shows Chris and Stephen what they had done. They're finally able to take in this scene. And man, this scene was horrific. Kimberly had been hit with the machete in her head and torso 36 times. Her skull was split open, her left eye socket was destroyed, several organs were pierced, and some of her bones had been hacked to pieces. And she lived through all of that, dude, and it actually died from the massive blood loss. 11-year-old Jaimie did survive, but she had sustained massive injuries because she had been injured, stabbed, hit with a machete 18 times. Her skull was also split open. The force of one of the blows shattered her jaw. One of her feet was partially amputated, but by playing dead, this little girl lived. So Kimberly's dead, and Jaimie, her daughter, is playing dead, laying on the floor, trying not to move, trying not to breathe, while these men then raid her family's home, taking some items like one of David, her father's old wallets, a pearl necklace, and 2 wooden jewelry boxes before fleeing the scene. After they were finally gone, this is when Jaimie mustered all the strength she had in her body to get herself to a phone and dial 911. Once the boys fled the Kate's home and got to the car, they changed their clothes into new outfits, which they all brought along with them. Which is, again, like, how are you going to say you didn't know what was happening if you brought extra clothes with you? That doesn't make sense, but that's what they say. They changed into their clothes and then they went to leave. And reportedly, Stephen wanted to get out of the car and go carve the words, "You're lucky," into the fence outside of Kimberly's neighbor's home, the home that they were initially going to break into but didn't. But for whatever reason, he didn't go out and do this. But just the thought is like, this kid is so fucked up. There's something wrong there. After leaving Kimberly's house, they drove Billy back to his car, which was left at Walmart where they had met. He gets in his car, he goes home. They drive Quinn to his house and drop him off. And then they drive over to Autumn's house, getting it there at about 5:30 a.m. And Autumn, again, was their alibi. Reportedly, he had no idea what they were doing. This is what he says. This is what they confirm. That they told him they were doing something, but didn't get into specifics so that he couldn't get in trouble too. Which, spoiler alert, that didn't work out for him. Now, once they got to Autumn's house, reportedly, they were jazzed. They were hyped up. They were pumped. They're like jumping around there in a good mood. And Autumn's like, "Hey, what's the dealio? Like, why are you guys so excited?" And I believe it was Stephen who told him that they had just killed 2 people. He said it super calmly, like he was just talking about the weather, like it was no big deal. And Autumn, knowing Stephen and knowing how Stephen liked to just talk shit and not be very serious, he thought that this wasn't true. And this is what he says, that he thought that this wasn't true, that maybe they committed a robbery or something, and that's why they're all pumped. But he definitely didn't believe that they had really killed someone. Yet, when the boys said that they wanted to destroy evidence, he agreed to help them. Apparently, initially, Stephen and Chris wanted to burn all the evidence, but Autumn had a great idea and was like, how about instead we throw it in the river? So he, Chris, and Stephen walked to the Nashua River, and when Stephen asked Autumn to be the one who would throw the items in the river to actually physically do the act, Autumn agreed. Autumn said at this point he started to believe that Chris and Stephen had actually killed someone. So when they initially admitted, when they initially told him what they had done, he was like, no, that's bullshit. But during the walk over to the river, they had been talking to him. They had been telling him the specifics of the evening. And he was like, you know what? That actually sounds fucking legit. And I don't know where you would come up with this information if it wasn't true. So Autumn helped them destroy this evidence. And by destroy, I mean waterlog it. And later, Autumn actually did lead the police to the area of the river where the evidence had been thrown in. And this evidence consisted of several things like a small jewelry box, an air conditioner screen, some rubber gloves, a plastic bag, an insurance card that belonged to David Kimberly's husband, a red sweatshirt with Stephen's name written in it, socks with Chris's name written in them, among other things. There are other things, but those are all the ones I can remember. And real quick, I want to talk about these things. Specifically, I want to talk about the socks, and the sweatshirt. Because the same kid who was young enough and immature enough to write in his red sweatshirt, quote, "This is Steve's sweatshirt. Steve, who is awesome," also bragged to friends about waking a woman up with a machete to the skull. But anyways, back to Autumn. Autumn led police to this evidence in the river, which was kind of ballsy for Autumn to do in his mind because Stephen had threatened him. Stephen had told him, like, listen, there are only 5 people on the planet who know what we did, which we know wasn't true, but this is what he's telling him. And he's like, and 4 of them committed the crime. So if police start sniffing around, we know who told them. And I love you like a brother, but I'll kill you too. But still, Autumn led the police to the evidence that was in the river. And that wasn't the only evidence, though, because there was other evidence that Stephen and Chris did bury. They buried it in like a field or something, or some open land that was near Chris's house. And the stuff that they buried was jewelry that they didn't get a chance to pawn, the machete, the knife, and 2 iPods. One from the murder of Kimberly and the attack on Jaimie, and one from a previous robbery that they were able to link them to based on this iPod and other evidence, which I did know about it. They actually robbed somebody that like Chris knew, and the person was so surprised because I think they went to church together and stuff, but still, pieces of shit are gonna be pieces of shit. So anyway, they buried all of that stuff, but not before taking the weapons and showing them off to all of their friends, because like, why would they not? They were so pumped about what they did, man. They could not keep their mouths shut. Billy said that Chris and Stephen were always talking about what they did, that they were amused by what they did. He said that they didn't seem affected by it at all, that they would literally laugh when they were recounting it. Quinn said that Chris and Steven were proud of what they did and said that Chris had said that he was proud and happy to have been the one to hurt Jaimie. And this is something that I guess started like a fight between Chris and Quinn because they started arguing about the ethics of hurting a child. And I guess this fight obviously didn't get very big because like nobody did anything to the other, and Chris we know is capable of hurting somebody, but I guess Quinn did make it known to him, or so this is what Quinn said, that he did not think it was cool to hurt a woman and a child. But still, the boys continued to talk about what they did. They talked about what their reaction would be. Billy said to them like, oh, we're probably going to be in the newspaper. Even if like our names aren't in there, what we did will be in there. And this was interesting because I guess Billy was the type of person who always wanted to be in the newspaper since he was a little kid. And Billy, I don't know, man, he's a little bit, I don't know how I feel about him because I guess he and his dad even sat down and talked about like selling his story to a newspaper. And I just feel conflicted about Billy. I feel they all suck, right? They all suck for being involved in this. Quinn sucks too, but I feel like if we were ranking them that Billy would be above Quinn and suck and suck. And he just makes me feel a little uncomfortable personally. They all do though. Fuck them all. Fuck them all. But anyways, back to them running their mouths because it definitely ended up biting them in the ass a little bit. Because, okay, before they ended up burying the weapons, they were showing them off to a friend of theirs. This was specifically a friend named Kyle. They go to his house. They show him the weapons. They tell him all about what they did. And he's like, no doubt, no doubt. Cool, cool, cool. They leave. He goes to his mom and he's like, let me tell you what happened. Tells his mom what they said. She immediately contacts the police because obviously she would. Why did they think everybody would be cool with that? Like, they were dumb. I'm glad they were dumb, but they were dumb. So she, of course, contacts the police, tells them everything that she knows, and this led to them being arrested. But before they were brought in, they did crash out a little bit, or specifically, Steven crashed out. So they had told all these people what happened, right? And Steven is starting to get nervous about the number of people who know. And specifically, he starts freaking out about a friend of theirs named Eldon, I believe was his name. So Eldon is at Quinn's house. They're all at Quinn's house. They tell Eldon what happened, and Steven starts to freak out. He's like, you know what? Actually, we should kill Eldon. We should do that because he knows our secret. And I'm like, you told him? You want to kill somebody for knowing a secret that you told them about? Like, that seems ridiculous. But this is what's going on in Steven's head. And when Steven expresses this, there's a bit of like inconsistencies in like how the people feel about it. Chris is like, kill Eldon? Hell yeah, absolutely. I would love to kill somebody else. Let's do that. And Quinn's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's not. Like, I'm not down with that sickness, and is able to make a case for Eldon's life and convince them that like no one will say anything. But we know that that wasn't true because they did end up being arrested. But before being arrested, they were brought in and they were questioned about the murder of Kimberly and the attack on her 11-year-old daughter, her attempted murder. And Chris said that once they were brought in, Chris said that he was surprised to have learned that Jaimie had lived. He said when the boys found out, they were very nervous, but they were also super childish and big dickheads about it because they started, and I don't care if somebody gives Chris a hard time because Chris can suck it, but they started giving Chris a hard time for not even being able to kill a kid. I guess the moment that he found out he was with Autumn and he was with Steven, and they started giving him a hard time and started calling him a murder virgin. Autumn was part of that. And Steven even apparently, according to Chris, said to him, like, quote, loose quote, at least I killed my bitch. And what's stupid here is that Chris said that he kind of wished that Jaimie had died for her own sake, not for his sake, but for her own sake, because now she was going to have to live with everything that happened to her and the death of her mother. And he said he was the kind of person that if he wanted to go in and kill somebody, he was going to make sure that they died because he had lived through trauma and he didn't want anybody else to have to live through something like that, which is so annoying. Chris is so annoying. All of these guys are so annoying. So let's move on. They were all arrested, okay? Chris was arrested. Steven was arrested. Billy was arrested. Quinn was arrested. And Autumn was arrested because though he wasn't there, they believed he was complicit. And I just remember that I can't even stop talking about how stupid these guys are because Steven continued. Steven continues. This is what Steven does. If he does anything, he's going to continue. After he was arrested, he still couldn't stop running his mouth. And he even had the audacity to write a letter. Who did he write this to? I don't remember, but in the letter he wrote that the citizens of New Hampshire were uninformed idiots, and then he shamed David Cates. David Cates, who lost his wife and almost lost his daughter because David had been upset when the school yearbook was released and it had Billy and Quinn's photos in it because they were still in school, which Billy seems too old to have still been in school, but I don't know about that. Either way, David was upset that they were in the school yearbook, and Stephen found out about this and wrote this letter. And in it, he said, quote, "It is not Billy and Quinn's fault that they were arrested and charged with what they were charged with. And yet, through all the struggle, they both are still just trying to get an education." And it's it actually is their fault that they were arrested because they participated in a murder. They were there. That's what they were arrested for. Hello? Is this thing on? But this wasn't the only letter that Stephen wrote, because he wrote another letter. He wrote a letter to a fellow inmate named Chad Landry. And in this letter, he described, quote, "the preparation, attack, and the hours and days following the murder in excruciating detail." And obviously police and the guards and all that got this letter, so now they had this to use against him. Though later, his defense attorney would try to say that though this letter was written in great detail, he wasn't writing this letter because he was guilty. He was just writing this letter to brag, to seem cool. It didn't mean that he actually did it, though, just in case you were curious. But let's fluff that up. Let's just go through the legal part of this a little bit. It's short. I know everybody doesn't like the legal stuff, but some of the stuff is, well, to me, it's all interesting. That's why I'm telling you about it. But I think you'll be interested too. So let's start with Billy and Quinn. Billy and Quinn were both given plea deals for testifying against Christopher and Stephen. And Quinn was the first one to spill his guts and tell them basically everything. And I don't know if he actually did feel bad about it, but he seemed to feel bad about his participation in this crime. And he said to the judge of this quote, "Every moment that I close my eyes, I see what I could have done and how I could have presented this horror that I helped set in motion. There's nothing I can ever do that can ever make up for my despicable actions, for the cowardice I show." He then pled guilty to robbery, burglary, and conspiracy to commit burglary. That's a hard word. And he was given 20 to 40 years in prison. And as far as Billy goes, he pled guilty to burglary, first-degree assault, and conspiracy to commit murder, and he was given 30 to 60 years in prison. And from what I read, both Quinn and Billy have come up for parole, but from what I can see on the interwebs, neither of them have been released. But speaking of release, actually, let's get into Autumn, because he didn't get away scot-free at all. He was sentenced to a minimum of 5 years for hindering apprehension and conspiracy to hinder apprehension, and he was actually paroled in 2015. So he's out there somewhere in the world doing something. Don't know what, didn't look into him, don't want to know much about him, but I would think maybe he would change his name, which is a shame because Autumn is actually a very cool name for a guy. I had never seen a guy named Autumn, but I liked it. When I was first reading about this, I thought that it was a chick, obviously. Well, not obviously, because it's not obvious. But I think that that's a cool name. So if you changed it, consequences for actions, buddy. Let's now talk about Chris. So Chris did go to trial, and he pled not guilty for his crimes, but said that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. But in doing that, he admitted that he did what he did, but just said he was insane when he did it. So that was interesting, and that was an issue for him because since he had admitted what he did, if the jury found that he was guilty, that he wasn't insane, that he was guilty, he was up for life in prison without parole. But if the jury found that he was insane at the time the murder was committed, the judge would then have to have a hearing to determine if he was still a danger to society, so they knew what to do with him at that point. If the judge did find that Chris was still a danger to society, which seemed pretty likely, Chris would be sentenced to, quote, a secure psychiatric ward of New Hampshire State Prison, and he would then be entitled to have a review of his threat to society every 5 years. But in the end, a court psychiatrist shot this not guilty by reason of insanity shit down so fast and was able to prove that Chris did know what he was doing when he did it, and he chose to do it. And this did seem to be true just based on everything I already told you about what Chris said. And also the fact that he said that if given the opportunity, nothing could stop him from killing again. So Chris Gribble was found guilty on all of the charges against him. But before he was sentenced David Cates, Kimberly's husband, Jaimie's father, had the opportunity to speak to him directly. And he said, quote, "This verdict is not justice, but I can only hope that justice will find you very soon." He then called Chris a worthless coward for taking his wife's life and causing his daughter to ache for the rest of her life for having to live through and endure what she did when she lost her mother and almost lost her own life. Christopher Gribble was then sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, and the judge told him, quote, "Infinity is not enough jail time for you." And then after the sentencing, the judge told Jaimie, and I quote, "This man and the other men involved in this terrible crime can never hurt you again." So Chris is in jail and he's still dangerous, dude. There was a point where he was actually moved to a less secure wing of the prison, but ended up being returned to maximum security just 3 hours later because he couldn't stay out of trouble and immediately got in a fight with another inmate. So goodbye to Chris. So let's now talk about Steven. Steven is last, and I saved him for last intentionally because he had some BS that came up after his trial that I wanted to touch on a little bit. As you may suspect, though, before we get into that, as you may suspect, Steven did not take his trial seriously at all. He laughed, he joked, he even asked his attorney if his attorney thought that the jury would sing him happy birthday. And all of this energy, this temperament lined up with all the evidence they had against him, which was his own words. He told everyone who would listen what he did in great detail. And he reportedly even said, and this is graphic, I'm going to tell you now, but he reportedly boasted about the amount of blood that he had seen, and then happily talked about how Kimberly's brain was left exposed and her eye was, quote, ejected from its socket by the ferocity of his blows. Anyways, let's move on. In October of 2010, a little more than a year after the murder was committed, and on Steven's 19th birthday, after, 3 hours? No, less, 90 minutes. After 90 minutes of deliberation, Steven Spader was found guilty of all the charges against him. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, plus an additional 76 years for the attempted murder of Jaimie. And reportedly, the judge, quote, made each of the sentences consecutive to one another to ensure that he would stay in that cage for the rest of his pointless life. Now, I did mention that there was a little more that happened with Steven after he was sentenced, and that is because in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled against sentencing minors automatically to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Now, when this happened, there was a great amount of concern around Steven because he was underage when he committed the crimes he committed. So they were worried that he would petition the court, get a new trial, and maybe be sentenced differently, and nobody wanted that. But in a shock, Steven actually filed a motion to not change his sentencing, to not get another trial. He said that he wanted to stay in jail because he was, quote, the most sick and twisted person you'll ever meet. And the court granted his motion to not redo his trial and to not be resentenced. And honestly, I think it checks that he is one of the most sick and twisted people because the last I checked, he was in a maximum security facility that housed the, quote, most difficult or dangerous inmates. Okay, so you take that and the fact that even he doesn't think he deserves a second chance. So they did end up having to have a hearing about this. It's just how the court system works. And Steven, waived his right to appear there personally and told his lawyers, do not argue to get me out. He said that he did not want to slip by on a technicality and said that he wanted to take responsibility for his actions. Now, is that true, or is it just that he's been having a pretty good time in prison? Because I did see an article from his family that said that he's adjusted there well, but who knows? Probably not that he cares about how anybody else feels, though, just based on who he seems to be as a person. Now, the prosecution was at this hearing as well and agreed that Steven needed to take responsibility for his actions. They said that he was a psychopath. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't something he'd grow out of. This is who he was. And he needed to stay in jail for life, stay in prison for life. This is good. They said that not only should his life prison sentence be secured, but also he should still serve those 76 years for attempting to murder Jaimie Cates. Now, while in court, he did have a letter read out, a statement of his was read out in court through his attorney, where he apologized, and he said, quote, "Through my impulsive actions, I have torn apart families and ruined lives. I am truly sorry for the pain I have caused you. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve any. And this was an apology that Kimberly's family did not accept, okay? They were there. Kimberly's daughter, Jaimie, who had survived this man's vicious attack, was there, and she and her father said that his apology was just insulting. Now, Kimberly's family has stayed mostly silent in the wake of her murder. I know that they did create a scholarship fund in her honor because of Kimberly's love of children. This is the Kimberly L. Cates Memorial Scholarship, and they have made it their mission to, quote, inspire young people to follow their passion for caring for others and to support them as they begin their post-secondary studies in the field of medicine. So just like Kimberly. Which, I think is a beautiful way for them to honor Kimberly. And as for them, they've repeated the same sentiment through their brief statements. And that was, quote, David and Jaimie wish only to heal and move forward. And I really hope that they've been able to. I don't know how someone could, but I hope they have been able to the best of their abilities. So anyways, back to Stephen. In their decision, the state of New Hampshire said that Stephen lacked remorse. Stephen himself admitted that he didn't feel remorse and saw remorse as a sign of weakness. And so the state decided that if he had ever been released, he would go on to commit further crimes. So his sentence was upheld. So all of these men are in jail where I think it's safe to say that they all belong. You'll have to let me know what you think. When it comes to Stephen and it comes to Chris, I think it's pretty clear. I think we can all agree that they should probably be in jail for the rest of their lives. I think where it could get divisive is when it comes to Billy and Quinn. So you'll have to let me know what you think in the comments below. I think what we can say for sure, though, is that this was quite the frightening and life-altering experience. It was life-altering for Kimberly's family, and it was life-altering for New Hampshire. In response to this murder, there was legislation passed that changed the law. They made it so that basically what could be punished with the death penalty, like what was punishable with the death penalty, was broadened to include murders that were committed during a home invasion. Though in the end, it didn't end up mattering at all because the state ended up repealing the death penalty as a whole. But the point is that this case was horrific enough to incite change. And not even just on that type of legal level, but also on a personal level. I cannot even imagine how this crime changed David and Jaimie and their family and everybody who loved Kimberly. I just wish them all the peace in the world. But also this changed Mont Vernon. This small, isolated town where everyone knew everyone and nobody locked their doors was changed forever. Doors were locked tight. People bought guard dogs. People bought guns. And some people even kept axes next to their beds. This crime changed people on a deep level and ejected them from their sense of security and put them straight into the mindset that this type of crime, these murders, these random attacks could be the new and terrifying normal. And with that, my friends, is the story of the murder of Kimberly Cates and the attempted murder of her daughter, Jaimie. I hope that you found it to be informative. I hope I gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I just want to thank you for remembering Kimberly and Jaimie with me today. Now, considering everything I told you throughout this video, I want to revisit the question of the day, and it was a simple one. It was this. Do you think that any of these men who were involved in the murder of Kimberly and the attempted murder of Jaimie should ever be given the opportunity of parole? In your mind, not in what actually happened, because we know. In your mind, do you think that any of them should have been given that opportunity? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, because I am curious to hear what you have to say. Anyways, guys, before you leave, please don't forget to leave me a comment down below with whatever case you'd like to see me cover in the future. As you know, I have a long list of cases. Whenever you leave me a suggestion, I put it on my list with your name next to it, so if I cover it, I can give you a shout out. I love looking into the cases you guys suggest because they're often cases I haven't heard of or cases that need more coverage, and I know you're filled with great ideas and great taste, otherwise you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing, ringing the bell, commenting down below, and introducing yourself. I put out new videos every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below, along with a link to my membership and a link to my merch store. And if you don't already know, now you know, this YouTube situation that I'm doing, it's also a podcast. So if you search True Crime with BRATTERSTEIN, wherever you watch or listen to podcasts, you will find me. And I would appreciate it if you would like it, or whatever it is. I don't know what you do on podcasts. Share it. I'm just trying to get in the algorithm, but if you can't or you don't want to, that's fine. I just want to thank you for being here. And now with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. I hope to see you in my next video. And in the meantime, take care of yourself.